So there I was, out with my German Shepherd Max, on our usual evening walk. We'd taken this route around the outskirts of our little town in upstate New York countless times. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but nobody really knows you for real. Well, at least not me. I moved here about 5 years ago, looking for a fresh start away from the city. I'm a freelance writer, which means I spend most days cooped up at home, just me and Max and the tapping of the keyboard. It was late September, and the leaves were doing their thing, turning all shades of fire. There was a chill in the air reminding me that winter was coming. We were on this stretch of path that runs parallel to the dense woods of the Adirondacks. The sun was setting and getting closer to the horizon, leaving behind a sky that looked like ink to me, with just the first few stars starting to peek through. Max was a bit more on edge than usual. His ears perked up as if he was trying to catch something I couldn't. I figured it was just a deer. We'd seen plenty in the woods before, but this time, he stopped dead in his tracks, staring into the trees with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tugged on his leash, trying to coax him along, but he was a statue, save for the low growl brewing in his throat. I squinted into the woods, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had caught Max's attention. That's when I heard it, a sort of clicking sound, like dry branches snapping, but rhythmic, deliberate. It was getting closer, and I could feel this pressure in the air, thick and heavy. I wasn't scared, not yet, curious maybe, but nothing I knew of made a sound like that. The clicking grew louder, and from the shadow of the trees emerged a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, and thin to the point of emaciation. Its skin was ashen, stretched over its bones like parchment. Its eyes were just empty sockets, and there was no way to tell what it was looking at. The legends of the Wendigo that I'd heard around campfires as a kid flooded back to me. Max's growl had turned into a full-on bark, the kind that says, danger. But the figure just stood there at the edge of the woods, unmoving and silent now. The air around us felt charged, and I knew we had to leave, had to get away from whatever this was and whatever was happening. My heart was racing, but I forced my feet to move, backing away slowly, not daring to turn my back on the figure. There was a stillness in the air that felt almost solid, like the world had paused on its axis. I didn't know what to do. Call for help, snap a photo, run. But my body seemed to have made the decision for me. The figure, the Wendigo, if my mind wasn't playing tricks on me, had a presence that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. It was tall, way taller than any man I've ever seen, with limbs that seemed to stretch too long for its body. The moonlight gave its skin a silvery sheen and made its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, seem like voids. I reached down without looking, my hand shaking, and gripped Max's collar to have an extra hold on him. He was still barking, loud and fierce, but even his sounds seemed to be swallowed up by the presence around that figure. I wanted to shout at it, to ask what it was, why it was here, but my voice was stuck somewhere in my chest. Not to mention that it probably would not have understood my words. And then, slowly, it moved. Or did it? The darkness played tricks, but I could have sworn it swayed, like a tree in a breeze that I couldn't feel. The clicking sound started up again, and this time, it was accompanied by a low, haunting whistle. The noise was unlike anything I'd ever heard, threading through the trees with an almost hypnotic quality. It was then, in that sliver of a moment, when my attention was split between looking at the figure and the strange sounds, that Max's collar slipped through my trembling fingers as he got away from me, dragging his leash. I gasped as I realized what was happening. He bolted towards the Wendigo with a ferocity that matched the pounding in my chest. Max! His name ripped from my throat. I sounded raw and desperate, but he didn't pause one bit, didn't turn back. I had a split-second decision to make. Go after him or stay safe on the path. My feet made the choice before my head did, propelling me forward after him, into the brush, twigs snapping beneath my boots. I could barely see Max now, just the lighter parts of his fur catching the moonlight as he got close to the figure. The closer he got, there was this weirdness in the air as it seemed to ripple, like heat over asphalt. My breath came in sharp gasps now, and my voice was lost as the wind picked up. But then, Max stopped, mere feet away from the Wendigo. He wasn't barking anymore. He stood there, facing the figure, his body tense but not aggressive. The Wendigo mirrored him, motionless, a statue carved from the night itself. The standoff lasted only moments, yet it felt like hours. I was close enough now to see them clearly. The deep grooves in the creature's skin, the unnerving stillness of Max. They were communicating somehow, in a language that went beyond words, a silent understanding that passed between them. And then, as if the moment was too fragile to hold, the Wendigo turned, its form dissolving into the woods with the same eerie grace with which it had appeared. Max watched it go, then turned to look at me, his expression unreadable in the dark. I approached him slowly, half expecting him to run after the creature again. But as I reached him, he simply nuzzled his head against my leg, a gesture so normal and grounding that I could have cried. We walked back home, the woods silent behind us, the weight of the encounter heavy on my shoulders. Max stayed close, occasionally looking back as if to ensure the Wendigo hadn't returned. When we got inside, I double-checked every lock, every window, but as the hours ticked by, the terror of the encounter began to fade, replaced by an unshakable curiosity. What had Max understood that I hadn't? What silent pact had passed between beast and dog in the heart of the Adirondacks? These questions haunted me, but as the first light of dawn crept through my windows, I knew one thing for certain: our walks would never be the same again. So, I was on this trip out in the American Southwest, a place I'd heard stories about but never thought I'd see myself. It's funny how you end up in places you never plan on. A buddy of mine, Jackson, convinced me to take some time off from the grind in Chicago and just go. Find yourself in the desert, he said, like it was some kind of riddle. But he was a bit out there like that. Still, I listened to his suggestion, and so there I was, in the middle of nowhere in Arizona, with nothing but red sand stretching out in every direction. Now, I'm a city guy, born and raised. The closest I'd come to nature was the big park in downtown Chicago, with pigeons that had more street smarts than some people I knew. But after a rough breakup and a job that felt like it was going nowhere, the desert seemed like as good a place as any to lose myself for a bit. I flew out there and bought this cheap, old, beat-up camper van from someone I found online. The van seemed like it had seen better days in the 70s. But the plan was simple: drive around, hike a bit, sleep under the stars, and just be alone with my thoughts. I'd been on the road for about a week when it happened. I was following this old map I'd bought from a gas station, the kind that's all creased and smells like spilled soda, when I found myself on the edge of Navajo Nation. I'd always had an interest in Native American culture, but reading about it and being there were two different things. There's a respect you start to feel for the land where you're in the middle of it. It's vast, and it's alive in a way that's hard to put into words. The spot I'd picked out for the night was right on the border of the reservation. It was legal to camp there, but it felt like I was pushing some sort of unspoken boundary. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were starting to peek out. I lit a small fire, not too big. I didn't want to attract any negative attention, and settled in. The silence out there is loud. It's not like the city where there's always something going on. Out there, the silence is its own noise, if that makes any sense. Almost like it's humming. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to the chill and crackling of the fire dying down. I tossed some more wood on it, and that's when I noticed something was off. You know how you can tell when you're being watched? It was like that. I stood up and looked around, trying to see if maybe it was an animal drawn by the fire or the smell of my food. That's when I saw it. There was a figure on the ridge of the hill, not too far from my campsite. It was too big to be a coyote, and too still to be some part of nature. The shape of it was human-like, but wrong somehow, like a shadow that didn't fit the body casting it. I'm not a superstitious guy, but I've heard enough stories to know that some things you just don't mess with. I remembered tales of skinwalkers, creatures from Navajo legend that are said to be able to mimic humans and animals, that they wear the skins of their prey. The rational part of my brain told me it was just a person, maybe a local wondering what I was doing there, but the rest of me wasn't buying it. I called out, a simple hello. My voice sounded strange, too loud and too small at the same time. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. The fire crackled and popped, and I realized it was the only sound I could hear. No insects, no distant howls, nothing. That's when it moved. Not walked or ran, but kind of flowed, like smoke caught in a breeze. It came down the ridge, not straight toward me, but at an angle, heading to the road. That's when I saw its eyes. They reflected the firelight like an animal's. My mouth was dry, hands shaking. I wasn't sure what to do. Running felt wrong, like it would trigger a chase, and I didn't want to find out how that would end. So I stood my ground, trying to make myself seem big and unafraid. But who was I kidding? I was completely terrified. The figure's eyes were locked onto mine, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and intent. It didn't move any closer, just watched me, and I watched it back. It was a standoff, and I wasn't sure what the rules were. My mind was racing. Every horror story I'd ever heard was playing on repeat. But this wasn't a story. This was happening to me, right here, right now. Then it tilted its head, almost curiously, like it was puzzled by my being there. Was it trying to understand what I was doing in its territory? Or was it deciding what to do with me? My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The fire flickered, casting long shadows, and for a second, it looked like the figure had multiple limbs, all twisting and writhing. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, and when I looked again, it was just the one shape. But it seemed taller, or maybe it was my mind going haywire. I thought about the van, which was about 30 feet behind me at that point. Could I make it if I ran? My keys felt heavy in my pocket, a lifeline so close yet equally far. I took a slow, subtle step back, trying not to show my panic. The figure stepped as I did, a single, smooth step forward. It was then I realized the fire was dying again, the light dimming, and somehow that seemed to start sapping my courage. I swallowed hard, trying to moisten my dry throat enough to speak. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my words. I took another step back, and this time, the figure didn't move. I took that as a sign, maybe a good one, maybe not. I kept my eyes on it as I moved, one careful step at a time, back to the van. It felt like an eternity, each step a decision that I worried could end my life. When I reached the van, I didn't dare turn my back. I opened the door, the creaking sound impossibly loud. I slid inside, keeping my eyes on where the figure stood, but it was harder to make out now with the fire reduced to embers. I started the van, the engine sputtering to life, and still, I didn't look away. As I began to drive off, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The figure was following, not running, but moving at an inhuman speed. It was gliding over the ground, as if it were part of the desert itself. My grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, and I pressed the gas pedal harder, the van kicking up a cloud of dust as I raced away from the figure that had me all confused. The road was bumpy, the van shaking, but I didn't slow down, not until I made it far away from that spot, and the surroundings took on the familiar shapes of rocks and cacti. Only then did I let myself breathe, let myself believe that I was away, safe, that it was over. But even now, as I sit in a crowded diner with the sun up and people around me, I can't shake the feeling of those eyes on me, of the silent figure that I'm still not sure what it was, or if it was even real. So there I was, halfway through my shift on a typical cool September night, in the outskirts of Juneau, Alaska. That night, I wasn't expecting much action, since our little town is usually quiet, especially after dark. But then again, being a cop here, you kind of learn to expect the unexpected. I've been on the force for about 10 years now, and nothing really shakes me up anymore. Or so I thought. My dad was a cop, and so was my granddad. Guess you could say it runs in the blood. I took up the badge right out of high school, wanting to keep the streets safe like they did. I've seen my fair share of bar fights, domestic disputes, and the occasional lost tourist wandering too far from their cruise ship. But what happened that night? Well, it was a new one, even for me. This night, I was driving along the usual patrol route with Leonard Cohen's gravelly voice humming through the speakers. As I passed the old Thompson Road, something caught my eye. Something that wasn't the usual stray deer or the neighbor's dog out for a late-night stroll. No, this was different. It was a light, or rather several lights, flickering in the dense woods beyond the roadside. They were bright and blue, with an unnatural pulsating rhythm. My first thought? Must be some kids with those new drones or lasers or LED lights messing around in the forest. So I turned the cruiser around, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and headed toward the source of the lights. As I got closer, the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. Something about these lights didn't match up with any of the possibilities I had thought of. I parked the cruiser and took out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the night as I cautiously made my way through the underbrush. I knew I should have called it in, waited for backup, but my curiosity got the better of me. Just a few more yards, I told myself, then I'll radio it in. But that's when everything changed. That's when I saw it. There, in a small clearing, was what I can only describe as a craft. It was sleek and metallic, with no seams or rivets, nothing like the planes we see flying overhead from the military base. And those lights, they weren't just on the craft, they seemed to be part of it, like the thing was alive almost, and glowing. I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. No sound, no movement, just those eerie lights pulsing. Then, as if on cue, a panel or door began to open, and that's when they stepped out. Beings, not people, not like any life form I recognized. They were tall, too tall, with skin that looked like a squid or an octopus. Weird example, I know, but that's what instantly came to my mind. And their eyes, if you could call them that, they were like pools of mercury. We stood there, me on one side of the clearing, them on the other. I wanted to reach for my radio, call for backup, but I unable to move. It wasn't fear, not really, it was more like they had a hold of me somehow. Or maybe it was the kind of fear you feel when you're faced with something so beyond your understanding that your brain can't even process it as a threat. I could see my breath in the air, feel the cold seeping into my bones, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. All I could do was watch as they moved about, their movements deliberate and purposeful. It was like they were inspecting the area. There was a rhythm to their steps, almost a pattern that felt both random and intentional. One of them, the one that seemed to be taking the lead, tilted its head ever so slightly. I don't know how I knew it was looking right at me, considering the lack of discernible features, but I felt it. It's hard to explain, but it's that feeling you get when you know someone's staring at you, even if you can't see them. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck, that instinctual awareness. I had that in spades. And then, without any warning, it walked towards me. Each step was measured, cautious, or was it curious? There was no sound. The distance between us closed, and I could see, no, not see, more like sense the intricacies of its skin. It was mesmerizing, and for a moment, I forgot to be scared. I forgot to be a cop. I was just a man, standing in the presence of the inexplicable. It stopped a few feet away from me, and that's when I noticed the others had encircled us, a silent audience to this terrifying meeting. I could feel my adrenaline surging, but my body was still a statue, refusing to obey any command to flee. Then it did something I'll never forget. It reached out a hand, and for a split second, I thought about retreating. But something inside me, call it foolish bravery or just plain foolishness, made me stay put. Its hand touched my forehead, and it was cold, colder than the Alaskan air around us. But it didn't hurt. There was a moment, brief and fleeting, where I felt a connection, like a current running between us. Images flooded my mind then, not my own memories, but sights and sounds and thoughts, I guess, from somewhere or someone else. I saw stars and skies I don't have names for, and landscapes that defied physics. Within minutes it ended, and the hand withdrew. The being stepped back, rejoining the circle, and I was left there gasping, trying to process the reality of what had just played through my mind. I didn't get much time to think it over, though, because in the next moment they boarded their craft without a sound. The panel sealed shut. The lights intensified for a brief moment, and then, with a faint whoosh, the craft lifted off. It didn't blast into the sky like rockets do. It simply drifted upward, gently, until it was just a speck against the night sky. I was alone again. My heart was still racing, my mind still reeling. What just happened? Did they mean me harm? Were they just curious? Or had they come with a purpose? A message conveyed through that touch? I eventually found the strength to move, to walk back to my cruiser, to pick up the radio. I hesitated, though. What could I say? Dispatch, I just had a close encounter of the third kind. They'd think I'd lost it, or worse, that I was unfit for duty. I decided to keep it to myself, at least for the time being. I drove back to the station, wrote up a report about a strange light sighting, leaving out the little green men, of course, and went home. I didn't sleep that night, or many nights after. That encounter, it changed something in me. I wonder who's out there, looking back, maybe thinking about the strange being they encountered on a small blue planet. And I wonder what they shared with me in that brief touch. What did they want? I still don't know. But I'm a cop, and every day I've got a new mystery to solve, which keeps me busy. Maybe one day, though, I'll find the answers to this mystery. Until then, I'll keep plodding along and keeping up with my work. Hi there. I'm a college student majoring in biology at Rutgers in New Jersey. I've always been into wildlife and stuff. You know, the usual birds, bugs, and even mammals. When I was a little kid, I'd spend all day out in the woods and always come home with some sort of insect or something in my pocket. And before you start to call me the geeky kind, let me just jump ahead of you and say it first. Yeah, I'm a geek. It was a weekend in late October, a typical chilly fall evening in the Pine Barrens. I was there for a field project, not about cryptids, mind you, but about the local ecosystem. I was camping out, collecting data on nocturnal animals. The Pine Barrens are huge, like really huge, and they've got this eerie silence at night that makes your ears go crazy. That night, I set up camp near a dense thicket, a few miles off any known trail. The plan was to stay up late, record some owl calls, maybe spot a fox or two. By midnight, the forest was dead quiet, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. I was jotting down notes when I heard it. A sound that wasn't quite animal, but not human either. It was this weird, shrieking cry, distant yet piercing. It had a rhythm to it, like it was intentional. Curiosity got the better of me, and also I was excited about a new sound, so I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the sound. As I got closer, the noise became more distinct, more unsettling. It was like a wail, but with a guttural quality that made my skin crawl. I moved cautiously, trying to avoid making noise, but the forest floor was littered with dry leaves, and each step sounded like a firecracker in the silence. Then I saw it. In a small clearing of moonlight stood a creature like nothing I'd ever seen. It was around 6 feet tall, with a head that seemed too big for its body, and eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. Its body was thin, almost emaciated, with skin that looked like leather. But what I instantly noticed was its wings, large bat-like wings that were folded behind it. I froze, not out of fear but out of sheer disbelief. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize this animal, this creature. It couldn't be the Jersey Devil. That thing was just a legend, right? But there it was, standing not more than 30 yards from me. You hear these stories, these legends, where cryptids are portrayed as monsters. but this was different. It had an almost human-like curiosity in its eyes, the way it tilted its head, observing me. It started to walk around the clearing, its movements deliberate and slow. Every so often, it would stop and glance back at me, as if making sure I was still there. It felt like it was inviting me to follow, to understand something. I know how this sounds, but in that moment, it felt like we were two beings, just trying to figure each other out. That's when it hit me. All the legends, the stories, they were born out of fear, out of not understanding what this creature was. Here it was, a living, breathing being, not a monster, but something else. Something that didn't fit into our neat categories of the world. The creature turned away from me then, walking towards the denser part of the forest. I followed at a distance, driven by a mix of fascination and a sense of connection. It moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the rugged wilderness of the Pine Barrens. As it walked, it glanced back at me, as if reassuring itself that I was still there. We reached a point where the woods became too dense for me to follow, without making a lot of noise. The creature stopped and looked at me one last time. That look, it's hard to describe. It wasn't just animalistic. There was an intelligence there, a depth that you don't see in wild animals. The creature's gaze held mine for what felt like an eternity. In those eyes, I saw the same curiosity that had driven me into these woods, to study, to understand. Then, subtly, the creature's demeanor shifted. It was a subtle change, but I sensed a kind of resignation in its posture, a recognition that our encounter was coming to an end. It was as though it had shared what it could, and now it was time to retreat back into the mystery from which it came. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself returning to that encounter in my mind, turning it over, examining it from every angle. The memory of the creature's gaze stayed with me. I read up on every piece of Jersey Devil lore I could find, but nothing seemed to capture the experience I had. It was as if the creature I met was something beyond the stories and the fear they inspired. That encounter in the Pine Barrens opened my eyes, and to not just believe the things we're told. I went back to my studies with a new perspective, a new respect for the unknown elements of the natural world. I can't prove what I saw that night. I have no evidence, no photographs, nothing but my own experience. But sometimes I think that's enough. The world is full of wonders, and not all of them are meant to be understood. Some are just meant to be experienced, to remind us that there is always more to learn, more to explore. So, that's the story. It's not a tale of terror or a sensationalized monster story. It's just an experience, one that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. All right, let me take you back to the fall of 2006. I was a seasoned park ranger at Yosemite National Park, having spent a good chunk of my life wandering, monitoring, and preserving the vast expanses of the park. It was my turf, you could say, and not much that happened there could escape my eyes or ears. I knew the lay of the land like the back of my hand. I've been in or near nearly every nook, cranny, and crevice of my territory. This day, I was out on a routine boundary patrol near the Ostrander Lake. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange hue. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the distant calls of a Steller's jay. It was peaceful as usual. I decided to check in on one of the lesser-used trails, a narrow path that wound through a dense stand of old-growth pines. It was there, as the light started to fail, that I saw something I couldn't explain. There was a figure standing off the trail in a clearing. At first glance, I thought it was a hiker, maybe someone in need of help. But as I approached, I realized this was no person. It stood towering over me with a posture that suggested that it knew a lot, a creature that knew how to stand its ground. Its skin was an odd, shimmering green, like the scales of a fish, but with the texture of leather. Its eyes were a bright, unnatural yellow, holding me in place with an intensity I've never felt before. I reached for my radio instinctively, but the static that came through was harsh, grating, and unnerving. The creature didn't move, even with the harsh static noise. It just stared, and I could see now that it had a kind of armor on its chest. Natural maybe, but who knows? Trying to keep my composure, I took a step back, slowly, to increase the distance between us. But the creature stepped forward, maintaining the close distance. I wasn't sure if it was a sign of intelligence or instinct, but I wasn't about to test which it was. Then it did something that will stick with me till my last day. It looked up to the sky and made a sound. It wasn't a growl or a hiss, but a kind of low hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate in the very air around us. I felt it in my bones, a sound that I knew was a call out to others like it. Then it started a series of clicking as if it was responding to an unseen ally. Eventually, the creature turned and walked away with a gait that was eerily human-like. It moved with purpose and disappeared into the trees. I've heard stories from hikers and campers, tales of strange sights and sounds in the woods, but I always took them with a grain of salt. But now, here I was, a rational, trained park ranger, questioning the reality of what my own eyes had just seen. I didn't sleep much that night, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. By morning, I had made a decision. I couldn't just sit on this. It was too big, too strange. But I also knew I had to be careful about who I told. I've seen what happens when stories like this get out. They take on a life of their own, twisting into something unrecognizable. And the last thing I wanted was a circus descending on Yosemite. I love this park too much to let that happen. So I confided in my supervisor, expecting skepticism, maybe even a laugh. But the look on his face was grave, and he listened intently, asking only necessary questions. He believed me, or at least he believed that I believed what I'd seen, and that's all I needed. We decided to keep it quiet, to conduct a discreet investigation. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety, relieved that I wasn't alone in this, but anxious about what we might find. We started by combing through recent reports, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Missing hikers, strange sightings, reports of odd noises. We dug through it all. It was a few days later when I returned to the site of the encounter. My supervisor insisted I take someone with me, but I refused. This was personal. I found the clearing, and it was just as it had been, undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that the creature had been there at all. It was a clear day too, and the sunlight filtered through the pine needles. I remember thinking that it should have been beautiful, but all I felt was a hollow uneasiness. I took out my notebook, a small habit from years of documenting poachers and vandals. Methodically, I started taking notes of the area, anything that might be used as a reference. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I felt compelled to look for something, anything that could explain what happened. It was then I noticed something odd about the bark of a nearby tree. It was subtly scored in a pattern that wasn't natural. I examined it closer, and it became clear that it was a marking, deliberate and precise, not something made by nature. The marks were too uniform, too intentional. I took notes describing what it looked like. My hands were steady, trained by years of experience, but my heart was anything but. This was a clue, a tangible piece of evidence. It meant something, though I couldn't begin to guess what. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I continued my search, moving further and further out from the clearing, but I found nothing more. As the sun began to set, I headed back, the feeling of being watched creeping over me with every step. I told myself it was just nerves. Back at the station, I pored over the notes. Those markings were unlike anything I had seen in my career, neither human nor animal. That night, I finally managed to sleep, but it was fitful and filled with dreams of yellow eyes, and the hum that felt like something was really wrong. There was something here, something real and inexplicable, and I had to understand it. My duty as a ranger had always been to protect the park and its inhabitants, but now I felt a new duty, to uncover the truth of what was sharing the wilderness with us. The investigation continued, quieter and more determined than ever. We expanded our search, bringing in a few trusted colleagues, each of them as baffled as we were. Every lead, every strange report was followed up on, but they all led to dead ends. It was as if the creature, whatever it was, had vanished into thin air. We're still thinking about, even though it's over 25 years later, but it's more in the background now. But rest assured, if there is any future development, you'll be one of the first people I share it with. Okay, let me set the scene for you. This isn't something I usually talk about, not just because it sounds out there, but also because even now, I get this eerie feeling just thinking about it. You ever been to one of those spiritual retreats? The kind where you're supposed to find yourself or whatever? Well, I did once, and let's just say I found a lot more than I bargained for. So, I was in this small town in Nevada, right at the edge of the desert. The place was called Spirit's Canyon. Not on any map, but it's not hard to find if you know who to ask. I was at a point in my life where things were just off. A friend mentioned this retreat where people went to align their energies and all that jazz. I figured I had nothing to lose. The retreat was this cluster of cabins circling a central communal area. It had a fire pit, a few benches, and a large decrepit statue of some sort of animal. At least, I think it was an animal. The people there were friendly enough, a mix of folks you'd expect to see, and some you wouldn't. I settled into my cabin, which was basic but comfortable. The first couple of days were fine. We'd meditate, share stories, eat simple meals, and take long walks in the area around us. But it was on the third night that things took a turn. That evening, the air was cooler than usual, and the sky was this deep shade of blue. I stepped out of my cabin because sleep was playing hard to get, and I thought a walk might do me some good. I wandered away from the main area. I remember looking up at the stars, thinking how they seemed to shimmer in the sky. As I walked, I noticed something odd about that animal statue in the center of the retreat. From the corner of my eye, it looked like it had moved. I laughed at myself for the thought. Statues don't move, right? But as I got closer, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had seen it move. I stopped walking. The statue, I could swear, was facing a different direction now. Its head turned towards the mountains in the distance. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, the air got colder, and the silence of the area was incredibly noticeable. I was right in front of the statue when that happened. There was no sound, no warning. 1 second, I was staring at this worn stone figure, and the next, the air in front of me twisted, warped. It was like the night itself rippled, and from that ripple stepped out something. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with skin that seemed to drink in the light around it. It had eyes, if you could call them that, which were like melted gold, shiny and fluid. I stood there, my heart racing so fast I could feel it in my throat, but not from fear. It was like my body understood something my mind didn't, that I was in the presence of something very powerful. We just looked at each other, me and this being. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like time had stopped just for us. Then it tilted its head, as if considering me, and it spoke. Not with words, though. It was like its thoughts just appeared in my mind, clear as if I'd thought them up myself. It asked me why I was there, what I was looking for. Its voice in my head was like the last whisper of a dream, fading as you wake. I tried to answer, I really did, but my voice was stuck. It's hard to describe, but in those moments of connection, or whatever it was, it felt like it understood me better than I understood myself. And that's a strange feeling, knowing something else, something so alien could see you so clearly. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those molten gold flickers staring back at me. Come morning, I was a mess. The other people at the retreat gave me glances. I must have had a strange look on my face, but I couldn't begin to explain what had happened. I mean, who would believe it? The day dragged on. We did our group sessions, meditated, ate in silence. I was there, but not really. My mind kept replaying the night before. I was anxious for night to fall again, half out of fear, half out of a desperate need to understand. Finally, the day ended, and our scheduled events were over. I couldn't stay away. I was drawn back to that statue. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding, but nothing happened. It was just a statue again. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Had I imagined it all? Was the stress of my life finally getting to me? Was I purging something here at the retreat that manifested itself in the statue? That was a weird thought. I decided to sit there, right in front of the statue, and just wait. Hours passed. The night was quiet. So quiet I could hear the blood thrumming in my ears. Then, without any fanfare, the demon was back. The air didn't ripple this time. It was just there. This time, I managed to find my voice. "What are you?" I whispered. I felt like I was a single drop of water trying to understand the ocean. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and awe-inspiring all at once. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. I asked it then what it wanted from me. It didn't need to answer because I knew. It was a reflection, a mirror. It was here to show me my own depths, to help me face the parts of myself I'd been running from. As dawn approached, I noticed that it was gone. I must have fallen asleep at some point, and so I stood. I left the retreat that day. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I couldn't. I drove for miles in silence, trying to process what had happened. I don't have all the answers, not by a long shot, but I started to fill the void with things that mattered. I faced parts of myself I had ignored, embraced the parts I'd hidden. The experience at Spirits Canyon, it changed me. And sometimes, when the night is deep and the stars are bright, I feel that presence and see it as a valuable lesson I learned. It's out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. For what, I don't know. But I'm no longer afraid. I'm ready for whatever comes next. I'd like to tell you about a night that's still etched in my memory like it happened yesterday, but this one unfolded in the swamps of Louisiana, around the Atchafalaya Basin. It's a place that's both beautiful and eerie, where the water's like a mirror, reflecting the twisted shapes of the cypress trees. Well, let's just say they can play tricks on your ears when the sun goes down. I've been wearing the badge in St. Martin Parish for more years than I care to count. Started as a patrol officer and worked my way up to detective. It's not the kind of place that makes national headlines, but it's home, with all the quirks and shadows you'd expect from a community living on the edge of an ancient swamp. This case, it was a missing fisherman, a guy who knew the waters better than he knew the back of his own hand. His boat was found drifting near Whiskey Bay, engines still running, tackle box open, like he'd just stepped out for a moment and forgot to come back. Search teams scoured the area, but after 48 hours, there wasn't a whisper of where he might have gone. That's when I got called in, to piece together the puzzle everyone else had given up on. The Atchafalaya is a world unto itself. You step off solid ground and everything changes. The air gets thicker, sounds are muffled, and every direction looks the same. Water, trees, and the endless play of shadow and light. I went in as the sun was setting. I had my boat, my gear, and a map that was as much use as a screen door on a submarine, considering how the channels out here change with every storm. Directions were useless. I was there to find answers, but the swamp, it's got a way of swallowing secrets and throwing them to the Spanish moss that hangs like ghostly curtains from the branches. As night fell, I cut the engine, listening. There's life in the swamp that doesn't care about human comings and goings. But over the croak of bullfrogs and the rumble of the wind, I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a wail, a cry that seemed so out of place that it left me with nothing but a shiver that wasn't from the chill. That's when I saw it, or thought I did, a shadow against the shadows, taller than any man, with eyes that caught the faint light. I reached for my flashlight, but something inside me said that was a bad idea. So I just watched, and the figure, it seemed to know I was there. The locals have a name for this thing. I knew it instantly from whispered stories that are told and retold, until nobody's sure what's true anymore. They call it the Rougarou, the Cajun werewolf, a creature that's more spirit than flesh, a guardian of the swamp that takes a keen interest in those who tread too deep into its domain. That night, with the wind blowing, I felt like an intruder in a world where I didn't belong, where this Rougarou creature was the law. Now, I'm not superstitious, never have been. But out there, you can't help but feel there's something ancient, something primal, that defies our modern notions of what's real and what's just legend. The Rougarou, they say, is a shapeshifter, a spirit of the swamp that can curse you with just a look, turn you into a creature like itself if you're not careful. And there it was, a figure shrouded in the darkness, its presence undeniable. It stood upright, with a silhouette that suggested power, something wild and untamed. It wasn't threatening, didn't growl or make any move to attack. It just stood there watching me, and I got the sense it was curious, maybe even amused by my boldness or stupidity. The Rougarou shifted, a subtle movement that seemed to ripple through the swamp. It was then I realized the creature wasn't alone. The swamp itself seemed to be connected to its movements, like the trees were its limbs, the water its skin. Time lost meaning as we stood there. The night sounds resumed, a gator's splash, the hoot of an owl, the distant call of a night heron. And with each minute that passed, I felt a growing respect for this creature. This guardian that I knew for certain was more than just a story to scare children. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the Rougarou backed away, dissolving into the fog that rose from the water's surface. I stayed still for a long while after, not daring to break the stillness that had settled over the swamp. When I finally started my boat's engine and made my way back to the real world, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been given a rare gift, a glimpse into a world that exists alongside ours. They found the fisherman, safe but shaken. He spoke of a presence that kept the other creatures away from him, a feeling of being watched over by something he couldn't see, but could feel. As for me, I filed my report, left out the part about the Rougarou, of course. They wouldn't understand, couldn't understand. Some things you keep to yourself because words just cheapen the experience, make it small and ordinary. Words can never capture strong emotions if you ask me. But every so often, I go back to the Atchafalaya, to the spot where I saw the Rougarou. I don't know if I'm looking for it or just paying my respects. Either way, the swamp knows me now. Or maybe it's more like I now know the swamp. I understand it better. I can't help but feel that I'm part of the story because of what I've seen. With my own chapter in the tale of the Rougarou, what they call the spirit of the swamp. So, I work in the subway, right? It's not like your typical 9 to 5. It's more of a whenever the trains are rolling kind of shift. The city never sleeps, they say, and neither do the subways. My spot is the maintenance crew down in the tunnels of Boston's oldest lines, the kind where the bricks could probably tell you some crazy stories from the 1900s. I never put much stock in spooky tales. I mean, working underground, you hear all sorts of things. Rats scuttling, old pipes groaning, the occasional echo of someone's laughter twisting down a tunnel. But this one night, the sounds were very different than normal. I was down near the Park Street station, the part where the green and red lines cross paths, right? There's this bit of tunnel down there that not many want to visit, even the most seasoned of us. We got this call over the radio about some power fluctuations, lights flickering on and off, that sort of nuisance. So, it's my turn to check it out. I grab my flashlight and toolkit. It's just past midnight, way past the buzz of commuters, just the last of the night trains passing through. The tunnel's damp that day, more than usual. The air feels heavy, like before a storm when the sky's about to crack open. High humidity, everyone kept saying. The lights are doing that thing where they dim and then flare bright enough to make you think they'll pop. I'm walking along the track, careful like, because the third rail's a mean bite if you touch it. I reach the spot where the lights are having a dance party, and I get to work. I'm checking the cables, the connectors, when suddenly the lights go out completely. Not flickering and no warning. They just go out. Pitch black, can't see my own hands in front of my face, kind of dark. The backup lights are supposed to kick in when this happens, but they don't. It's just me and the dark and the silence. Then I hear it. Not a rat, not the trains. It's a growl, low and mean, a sound that gets right under your skin like you've been cornered by a coyote or something. I flick on my headlamp and I swear it's flickering like it's scared too, but it's probably just my head bobbing around. The beam cuts through the dark, and there, in the shadows, are these eyes. Not tiny little rat eyes. Not human eyes either. They're red, glowing like the end of a cigarette in a pitch-black room, and they're watching me. My heart's racing, and I know I should get the heck out of there. But my legs have other plans, like they're cement attached to the ground. And just my luck, the growl gets louder, which to me means closer. So now I've got a job to do. I need to save myself. I finally get my legs to work, and I start backing up, slow, not taking my eyes off those red dots. I'm thinking this is it. Some subway beast is going to be the end of me. No more beers after shift. No more complaining about the socks with the guys. No more anything that's bad or negative. I would have sworn it all off in that moment. So, there I am, thinking about all the things I won't get to do anymore. But I'm not ready to be just a memory of a guy who worked in the subway. Not yet. I'm not a superstitious guy either, but right then, I'm praying to every saint I can think of. That's when the train's distant rumble starts up. It's not due to be here yet. I was supposed to still have some time on a free track, but here it is coming down the line. The sound gets louder. The rails start to move and squeak with the vibration. And I'm thinking, okay, this is my chance. The light, the noise, and the size of the train should scare off anything, right? Animals, they don't like lights and noise. So, I'm standing there waiting and hoping this will all be over. The train rounds the corner, headlight cutting through the dark, and for a second, I'm relieved. Except, the eyes, they don't budge one bit. They're unblinking, unfazed. And that's when I realize this thing isn't afraid at all. The train's barreling down, and I'm caught in the middle of the tracks, caught between a train and those eyes. At the last possible second, I jump out of the way, pressing myself against the tunnel wall. The train roars past, a blur of motion and noise. I'm pressed so tight against the wall I can feel every brick digging into my back from the change in pressure as it passes. The wind from the train's passing is like a slap, snapping me back to reality. When the last car passes, the eyes are gone. The tunnel's just a tunnel again. The air's just damp, not heavy, and I'm just a guy who should have been hit by a train but wasn't. I radio in to say the power's back on because, strangely, the glitch fixed itself. That's when I notice it. The silence isn't right. It's too silent. No rats, no dripping water, no distant echo of life above. I shake it off, pick up my tools, and I start walking back. I'm looking over my shoulder every 2 seconds, can't help it. When I finally get out of there, climbing up into the night air, I feel like I can breathe again. But it's like that tunnel changed something in me. It's like I'm a kid again who is now afraid of the dark. I can't shake the feeling of those eyes, or the sound of that growl that wasn't a growl. I pass it off and just tell myself it's from too much coffee, but deep down, I know it wasn't anything like that. So, there it is, the start of something I can't explain, something that makes me question all the logical, rational parts of my brain. I keep it to myself, but every time I clock in, I wonder if tonight's the night I'll hear that growl again, see those red eyes watching me again. And I can't help but wonder, what was it waiting for? What would have happened if that train wasn't early? I always thought legends were just that, tall tales from days when the world was still a mystery. But what I saw that evening made me reconsider everything. I'm the type that if you told me this story, I'd probably laugh it off. But here I am, telling it to you, and I swear every word is true. I was out in the woods of Bray Road, near Elkhorn in Wisconsin. It's a spot known for strange sightings, but I was there for the quiet, not the cryptids. I'm a wildlife photographer, and that night, I hoped to catch some shots of nocturnal creatures. The full moon was bright, casting long shadows between the trees, which made the woods seem alive, even if I was the only person for miles. The air was crisp, and the usual sounds of the forest filled the night. I had set up near a clearing. The moonlight gave everything a silvery hue that evening, but as soon as I set everything up, That's when it all got weird. The forest went silent. If you spend enough time in the woods, you know that's a bad sign. It's like every creature is watching for a predator and waiting for something bad to happen. I looked through my camera, scanning the clearing, when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a large dog, but as it stepped into the moonlight, I realized it was standing on two legs. This was no dog. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with fur as dark as the shadows it stepped out of. Its ears were pointed, and its snout was long and pronounced. I froze, my heart pounding so loud, I thought it might scare the creature off. But it didn't. It just stood there sniffing the air. Its eyes glowed like laser beams. I thought for sure it didn't realize I was there, but eventually it looked right at me. And the knowledge that I couldn't hide from it was terrifying to me. I couldn't move, couldn't even think about running. It's like my brain had checked out, leaving my body behind to face whatever was going to happen. The creature started moving, slowly, deliberately, circling the clearing. I followed it with my camera, the shutter clicking softly. It stopped and tilted its head, like it was listening for something. Minutes passed, but time didn't make sense anymore. It felt like we were the only two beings in the world. Then, it did something that chilled me to the bone. It started to speak. I don't mean it growled or howled. It spoke. The words were garbled, like it was learning to use its throat in a new way. But it was definitely trying to form words. I couldn't understand what it was saying, and honestly, I didn't want to. I just wanted this nightmare to end. The creature took a step toward me, its massive frame moving effortlessly. It was surreal, watching something so powerful and so terrifying move with such grace. It wasn't just the size or the fact that it only used 2 legs, but the sheer presence of it. This thing commanded the night. I wanted to scream, to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was a statue, a man paralyzed by the incomprehensible. It moved closer, and I could see more details. The fur was thick and matted in places, like it had lived its whole life outdoors, untamed, unafraid. The eyes, though, they were intelligent, deep, and a color I can't even begin to describe. They weren't the yellow of animal eyes caught in the light. They were something else entirely, like an amber hue that I've never seen before. It was then that the creature cocked its head, almost curiously. The mouth moved, and a low rumbling sound came out. It wasn't a growl, but something between a grunt and a word. My brain finally kick-started my survival instincts, and I remembered the camera hanging around my neck. Instinctively, I lifted it, not to protect myself, but to document this, to have evidence of what I was seeing. My finger trembled on the shutter button, but I managed to snap a few photos, the sound impossibly loud in the silence between us. The dog man, because what else could it be, seemed to react to the camera. It didn't lunge or snarl, but it stood up straighter, its posture almost one of annoyance. As if I had breached some unspoken rule of engagement, it was observing me, and now I had observed it back, an exchange that felt profoundly significant. I mustered the courage to take a step back, expecting it to charge, but it didn't. It just watched me, and then, to my utter disbelief, it mirrored my action, stepping back as well. Was it mimicking me? Trying to communicate? I couldn't understand. And then, the dogman moved away, its stride silent despite its size. It glanced back once, a look that I interpreted as a final acknowledgement, and then it was gone, melting into the darkness of the woods, as if it had never been there at all. I was alone again, the night sounds slowly returning. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted in the distance, and I was left to question the fabric of my reality. My heart still raced, my breath came in gasps, but my feet finally obeyed my commands. I packed up my things mechanically, leaving nothing behind but footprints. I reached my truck and didn't dare to stop until I was miles away, the moonlight fading behind me as I drove into the early morning haze. The photos, those cursed photos, were all I had left of the encounter. They were proof, but they were also a burden. Who would believe them? That night stays with me, etched into my memory with vivid clarity. I still go out into the woods, camera in hand, but now there's a part of me that listens for the silence The Dogman of Bray Road is real. I've seen it, and it has seen me. And the world feels like a stranger place because of it. You know how some people have those defining moments? The kind they can pinpoint in a story that goes, and that's when everything changed. Well, I never figured I'd have one of those, but I did. I'm just a regular guy, born and raised in a small town where everybody knows everybody. And if you don't wave back, you're probably having a bad day. I've been working at the manufacturing plant just outside of town since I got out of high school, 20 years this May, and I've been on the third shift the better part of the last 10. It's one of those massive places that looks like a giant gray box dropped in the middle of nowhere. I stick to myself there, always have. I like being alone. I'm not much for the bar scene or the church socials. Give me a quiet night and a clear sky. That's more my speed. My mom used to say I got my dad's temperament, quiet and a bit of a loner. He was a truck driver, gone most weeks, so it was mostly just me and Mom. She passed a couple of years back from cancer. It was rough, especially since Dad was long out of the picture. I guess that's why I took to the night shift. Less people, less noise, just me and the machines since this is a mostly automated plant. I never minded the solitude. There's a rhythm to the night that you start to feel in your bones after a while. It becomes a part of you, and I prefer it that way. It's quiet when you step out for a smoke, with no one trying to make small talk. Just the distant sound of the highway, with the occasional 18-wheeler passing through. It's not exciting, but it's a life. And it was enough for me, until that night. The night was like any other to begin with. The hum of the factory was a steady drone in the background. I like to take my breaks at the same time, give or take. This one was at 2:30 a.m. There was a spot out back, a little nook between a couple of storage units, where I could see the stars pretty clear. I'm no astronomer, but over the years, I've gotten pretty good at picking out constellations. I remember feeling off that night before I even saw it, like I was dizzy or something, like gravity or the earth was leaning the wrong way. I zipped up my jacket, shoved my hands in my pockets, and walked my usual route along the perimeter, finishing up my cigarette. That's when I saw it. It's funny how your brain tries to make sense of things, tries to fit them into boxes it understands. But this didn't fit in any box I knew. It was just there, hanging above the tree line, not making a sound. No lights, no engines, no nothing. Just a shape against the stars. I stood there, my mind racing to catch up with my eyes, wondering if anyone else in town was looking up and seeing what I was seeing. But I knew they probably weren't because it was the middle of the night. So I figured it was just me and this thing, whatever it was. And this is where I'll let you know that I have a pretty strict system. Everything in my life is measured and orderly. I have a place for everything, and everything is always in its place. I believe that's how you keep the chaos at bay, how you make sure things don't fall apart. So when I saw it there, this anomaly in my sky, it wasn't just a curiosity. It was a crack in the very foundation of my world. It bothered me like you wouldn't believe. I'd like to tell you I ran inside, grabbed a camera, or tried to call someone. But the truth is, I just stood there, my feet rooted to the spot. Officially, my break was over. I knew that. The line would be running and the caps wouldn't be checked. But none of that seemed to matter right then. This shape, it was like a shadow, but not, and it moved with purpose. It wasn't being tossed around by the wind or following a current. It was like it was alive in its own right. It came closer, and I could see it wasn't just one solid mass. It was made up of parts, segments, like a silent, undulating puzzle of darkness. There was no sound, no fanfare, no dramatics. The world was as quiet as it ever was, and now it was around 3 a.m. on a Wednesday night, except for this silent visitor. It felt like it was observing me, deciding what I was, what my little life was all about in the grand scheme of things. I thought about every story I'd ever heard, every late-night show with callers talking about lights in the sky, and lost time. I chuckled at them, the same way I chuckled at horoscopes and palm readings. But there I was, a living cliché, A guy working at a factory who'd tell a tale no one would believe. It hung there, and I felt something. Not fear, not really. It was more like recognition. It's hard to explain. It's like when you're a kid and you're sure there's a monster in the closet, but when you finally get up the nerve to look, you find an old baseball glove instead. Except the glove knows your name, and you know it's not just a glove. Weird, I know. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it started to move away. It didn't zip off at the speed of light or anything. It just drifted slow and steady until it was gone, like mist on a river at dawn. Just gone. And the stars were back, and the sky was just the normal old sky. I checked my watch. It was hard to see in the dark, but I could make out the hands. I hadn't lost time, hadn't been zapped to another dimension, or whatever happens in those stories. It was just later, and I was just there the same as always. Except now I had overstayed my break. I went back inside, my mind a riot of thoughts. The line was running, the caps were fine, the world was turning, and the night shift was just the night shift. I finished my shift. The machines didn't care about my weird encounter. Why should they? They were machines. Eventually the sun started to creep up, and just as I always did, I clocked out, got in my Ford, and drove the same road home, planning to arrive home at the same time I always did. I didn't look up though, not that morning. I wasn't ready to see the sky just yet. I still needed to think about it all first. I just kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel, the familiarity of the route home comforting me after the night's strangeness. In the rearview mirror, I caught a bit of a light and wondered how I would deal with this going forward. Because now, despite my desire for the mundane and the predictable, my world had expanded. There was a before, and now there was an after, and I was somewhere in the middle just driving home. So, I want to tell you about that time something wild happened to me. All right, let me take you back to this trailer park I call home, tucked away in the Northern California woods, not far from the Klamath River. Life here is simple, the kind of place where we're all in the same boat, and a neighbor's nod is as good as a handshake. It was a Tuesday when it all went down. Tuesdays are special around here, because that's when the steak truck rolls through, hawking meat that didn't sell over the weekend. I was between gigs at the time, so it was just me spending lots of time in my trailer and a pile of bikes I'd fix up and sell. It's quiet work, and I liked it that way. That evening, as the light was getting all golden and lazy, I was outside wrestling with a bike chain when this thumping noise started up. I'm telling you, it was weird, like someone was tossing around heavy logs out in the woods. I wiped off my forehead and stared hard into the trees, but the dusk made it tough to see. Thinking it was probably a deer or something, I didn't sweat it. They come down from the hills all the time, with the bucks sometimes rubbing their antlers on the trees. But this noise was different, heavier, more deliberate. My curiosity kicked in, and I found myself walking towards the edge of the park. It was cooler there. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles because there was less light over there. I moved into the trees, and that's when I saw something. It was huge and dark, standing upright like a man, but covered in fur. It was digging through a bear-proof trash can like it was looking for a lost set of keys. I think I may have gone into shock at the sight of it. I've heard folks talk about Bigfoot, but come on, you never figure you'll actually see one, like you never really think they're real. It looked over at me, and I swear it was like sending a warning to the person who's caught you eavesdropping. It grumbled, a deep sound that you feel in your body, and I just stood there, like it was completely in charge. This thing, this Sasquatch, it wasn't aggressive, just seemed curious. It picked up the trash can, easy as if it was a cardboard box, and started off into the trees with it. And for reasons I still can't fathom, I followed it. The deeper into the woods I got, the more alert I became. Every snapped twig or rustle in the bushes felt like more than it really was. The creature stayed ahead of me, never too close, but never out of sight for long. I was able to easily follow it as it was moving towards the hills. Time got weird in those woods. like it totally stopped and completely sped up at the same time. I kept tracking the creature until I reached a clearing at the foot of a cliff that stretched up into the sky. It was there I found a path of broken branches and that trash can, now all bent out of shape and emptied of its contents. For a brief moment I wondered who would be in charge of trekking out here to retrieve it. I stood in the clearing for a while, just taking it all in. The cliff loomed above me, and I figured that the creature was already at the top, which was too daunting of a climb for me. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, that same thumping sound, but closer this time, and so I second-guessed my thoughts on the creature's location. It's funny how your mind tries to make sense of things, how it tries to comfort you with logic when your gut knows better. I told myself it was just another animal making that sound, which would mean my life wasn't in danger. Maybe something had come over to finish off whatever scraps had been left from the trash can. But deep down, I knew what it really was. Then, there it was. The Sasquatch stepped out from between two pines, its massive form clear in the failing light. It was now a certainty that it was not at the top of the hill. It stopped when it saw me, and we stood there looking at each other across the clearing. I don't know why, but suddenly I wasn't scared. We just watched each other for a while. It didn't come any closer, and I sure as heck didn't move. I got the sense it was as fascinated by me as I was by it. After a long moment, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods with easy strides that covered ground fast. I didn't follow it this time. Instead, I hiked my way back to my trailer, my head so full of questions that I could barely remember my way back. But I eventually made it. The next day, I started asking around quietly, trying to find out if anyone else had ever seen something strange. One neighbor told me to ask Jerry, who lived a few trailers down and had seen more winters than most of us. I was headed over to his place when he intercepted me halfway there and pulled me aside. He spoke in a hush and told me he'd seen it too, years ago when the park was just a few homes, and the trees came right up to our doors. He described it just like I would have, a giant shadow that walked like a man. Jerry never mentioned it to anyone, said he didn't want to stir up trouble or seem like he'd lost his grip on reality. But he was willing to talk to me because he could tell from the whispers in the neighborhood that I'd seen the exact same thing. Hearing Jerry's story made me feel less alone, less like I was losing my mind. I kept to myself after that. Not that that was anything new, and I didn't go looking for the creature again. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear that thumping and I'd actually smile, knowing that I had a secret. And for some reason, I really liked that Jerry and I shared that secret together. I've been a park ranger here at Yellowstone for the better part of a decade. Yellowstone, with its geysers and wildlife, has basically been my home for nearly my entire life. You see, being a ranger isn't just a job, it's a calling. My dad was a ranger, and his stories of the park and its secrets were my bedtime tales. After he passed when I was young, I stepped into his boots, literally. I wore his old, worn-out hat and jacket my first day on the job. One autumn day, I was out on a routine check near the Lamar Valley after a storm had passed. There was a report of an injured bison, a young male, spotted by some hikers. I set out alone. That's typical for us rangers, though we always let someone know where we're headed. The sky was a dull gray, and a soft drizzle fell, making the ground soft beneath my boots. I reached the last known location of the bison, but found nothing. No tracks, no sign of struggle, no blood. Now, it's not uncommon for injured animals to move, but an injured bison, they're more likely to stay put. I decided to move deeper into the woods. After about an hour, I saw something. Not the bison, but a clearing up ahead that I never noticed before. I've patrolled this area countless times, but this area had somehow kept itself off of my radar. I stepped into the clearing. The air felt colder here. The drizzle turned to a fine mist that seemed to just hover in the air, rather than fall. The trees around the edge looked strange. They were white, as if bleached by the sun, their branches empty too. No leaves at all, which was strange this time of year. That's when I heard it, a low, ragged sound. Not a growl, not a call. something in between. It was ahead of me beyond the mist. I should have turned back, but for me, curiosity isn't a trait, it's a curse. I moved forward slowly, my hands trembling slightly. The sound grew louder, more distinct. I could hear a movement, a heavy, labored dragging sound. I thought of the bison. Maybe it was him, hurt and needing help. I picked up my pace, heart pounding, and there it was. In the middle of the clearing, a figure, tall, with its skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its head was a skull, antlered, with empty eye sockets that seemed to follow me. I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't a bison. It was something else. Something I've heard about in hushed whispers around campfires. A Wendigo is what they referred to it as. A creature of legend. It turned its head, and we locked eyes. Or, more like, where its eyes should have been. The world around us was silent in that moment. I felt an urge to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't comply. Eventually it moved, and it wasn't moving toward me but sideways, almost gliding. And with each movement, it seemed to fade and become nearly invisible and just a whisper of itself. I watched as it took off in a direction away from me. But instead of heading back to safety, something inside me stirred, an inexplicable urge to follow, to find out why. After years in these woods, this creature decided to reveal itself to me. My rational mind screamed to turn around, to report back about the bison, to forget what I saw, but my legs moved of their own accord. I followed the path the creature had taken, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I walked, the woods around me started to change. The trees seemed taller, the mist thickened, feeling like a cold, wet blanket. I should have been scared, but I wasn't. It was more like I was moving through a dream, my body on autopilot, my mind floating somewhere above, watching it all take place. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually the mist began to clear, and I found myself at the edge of a ravine. It was deep and the walls were steep, but down at the bottom, I could see a cave entrance. The Wendigo, or at least the last shimmering image of it, had headed in that direction. Taking a deep breath, I began to descend. The way down was treacherous, loose rocks and wet earth threatening to send me tumbling with every step. But I made it to the bottom, my hands and knees smeared with mud. The cave mouth loomed out from the face of the earth. There was a smell in the air here that was old and earthy, like damp leaves and rotting wood. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on. The light seemed feeble in the overwhelming darkness, but it was enough. I stepped inside. The air was cooler here, and I could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere further inside. The walls near the opening were covered in moss. That's when I heard it again, the low, ragged sound from before. It echoed off the cave walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I followed it deeper into the cave, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. The cave narrowed and I had to stoop to continue. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and then the cave opened up into a larger chamber, and there it was. The Wendigo stood at the far end of the room, its back to me. It was motionless and looked like a statue carved from bone and sinew. I approached with my heart thudding so loudly, I was sure it could hear it, but it didn't move. I stopped just a few feet from it, close enough to see how odd and oddly mesmerizing it looked. Its skin was all stretched over bones that jutted out. Even though it was kind of scary, I couldn't help but be a little amazed. There was something about it that was hard to look away from. It was there, this thing from all the campfire stories, just standing still. It was overwhelmingly obvious that this creature belonged here, belonged in this park probably more than any human ever would. Then it just backed away and sort of just became part of the cave. And just like that, it was gone. I didn't chase after it or anything like that. It felt like that would have been wrong somehow. I walked out of there with a weird mix of feelings, not sure if I was scared, sad, or just plain bewildered. All I knew was that I'd keep this to myself. Telling people wouldn't do any good, and I knew I'd never be able to come up with the words to adequately describe it. Let's just say I sort of feel reborn when I'm in the park now. I'm seeing everything through a new lens, and with lots of new understanding. Alright, so here's how this went down. I've been working in corporate jobs for a good chunk of my life. Tech industry. Lots of screens, loads of emails, never-ending pings on my phone. My name's Sam, by the way. I got to a point where I couldn't tell if I was blinking or if it was just the screen refreshing. So, I decided to cash in those vacation days that were piling up. I needed to head out and do something different, something real for a change. I picked a sea cruise for no other reason than I wanted to see far into the distance for once, not just another cubicle wall. So, I got online and found the perfect week-long cruise along the coast of Scandinavia. Yep, I went that far away, which felt great. I had visions of being like a Viking in the Nordic Sea, hundreds of years before computers. So, I flew into Oslo, spent the night in a hotel, and the next day boarded the boat. The boat was nice, nothing too fancy, but it had that old-world charm to it. It was one of those smaller vessels that promised a personal experience with the sea, whatever that meant. Now, I'm not much of a socializer. I mean, I can hold a conversation, but I'd rather not, you know? So most times I found myself leaning on the railing, just watching the waves. I was 4 days into this cruise, and that was my routine. Wake up, coffee, stare at the ocean, maybe read a bit, dinner, bed, rinse and repeat. Of course, there was also the daily trip off the boat for sightseeing. But this one night, I couldn't sleep. We were somewhere off the coast of Norway, and the sky was just this endless canvas of stars. I figured I'd get some air. I walked up to my usual spot, and that's when things got weird. The sea was unusually calm, like glass. It's eerie when it's that still, and you're the only one out there. So I'm looking out at the sea's surface, and suddenly, there was this movement in the water, but it was so subtle. I almost convinced myself it was my eyes playing tricks on me. But then it happened again, closer to the boat this time. It was like a shadow, massive and fluid, bulging the water up. You have to understand, seeing something that doesn't make sense in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the night, is completely confusing. Your brain just doesn't accept it at first, because you're out of your element and don't know what's normal and what isn't. I kept watching, trying to make sense of it. This shadow, it started to take a form. I could make out parts of it breaking the surface, long and sleek. Not a whale or anything I could identify. Then it rose higher. Part of it did anyway. It was like a cross between a snake and, I don't know, something prehistoric. I was alone out there. The only sound was the low hum of the boat's engines. No one else out there to validate what I was seeing. This thing, it had these, I guess you'd call them spines or ridges along its back, catching the moonlight as it moved silently alongside the ship. It wasn't aggressive or anything. It didn't seem to notice the boat or me for that matter. It was just there. I watched it for a good while. At least I think it was a while. Time felt funny, stretched out and condensed all at once. The thing about the ocean is that it's full of mysteries, right? We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the deep sea. That's what I was thinking when this creature, this sea monster, slid back into the depths as quietly as it had appeared. I stood there for a long time after it disappeared. My hands were gripping the railing so tight. My knuckles were white. You ever have one of those moments where your body reacts before your mind catches up? That was me. My heart was racing, but my thoughts were just a jumbled mess. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bunch of sea debris tangled together, looking like something else. Deep down, though, I knew it wasn't that. I've seen logs, seaweed, all sorts of junk floating around, and that is not what this was. This thing moved with purpose. Eventually, I realized I was freezing. It must have been the shock, or maybe it was just the night air. I didn't really feel it until then. I rubbed my arms trying to bring some feeling back into them, and that's when I decided to head back inside. I took one last look at the sea, half expecting the thing to re-emerge and confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But the water was still again, like nothing had happened. Back in my cabin, I couldn't just go to bed. I turned on the lamp and sat there at this little desk they had in the room. There was a pad of paper and a pen, probably meant for writing postcards or something. I started to write down what I saw. every detail before it slipped away from my mind. The curve of its back, the size compared to the boat, how it didn't make a sound. I wasn't planning on showing it to anyone. It was just for me, to make it real somehow. Then I got up and paced around. The room felt too small all of a sudden. I thought about waking someone up, telling the crew, but what would I say? Hey, I just saw something impossible. Care to take a look? They'd think I was drunk or dreaming. Plus, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it wasn't a danger. It felt like a secret, something shared just with me. I ended up at the window, just staring out at the darkness. I watched the way the moonlight played on the water, creating a path that seemed to lead somewhere far away from everything. It was beautiful and unsettling all at once. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but I remember jumping at every little sound the ship made. Every creak and groan sounded like it was that creature coming back. But each time I looked out, nothing was there. The next morning, everything was normal. Too normal. The sun was up, people were having breakfast, talking, laughing. The sea was just the sea. I almost convinced myself it was a dream, but the writing on that pad of paper was too detailed, too desperate to be anything but real. And that's how my ordinary cruise became something else entirely. I kept to myself even more so after that. I'd still stand at the railing, looking out at the water, wondering about what was living beneath the surface, about how much is out there we don't understand. I guess I got what I wanted, something real, something beyond my little world of cubicles. But it's one thing to wish for adventure. It's another to meet the unknown face to face. And I'm still not sure what to make of it all. So I work at this little library in my hometown, right? Small place, you blink and you'd miss it driving by. It's in Ohio, where not much happens except the occasional high school football win that gets everyone talking. I'm the librarian there, but I also teach this class at the local college about folklore. You know, stories about strange things and ideas that have been passed down for generations, like legends that grandparents swear are true. Well, this one night after class, I'm driving home and it's super dark out. The kind of dark where you can't see 2 feet in front of you, so I'm going real slow. I like taking the back roads because they're quiet, and I can drive at my own pace with no one on my tail. I just sort of unwind from the day like that. There's this stretch of road with woods on both sides where it feels like you're driving through a tunnel made of trees. It's kind of creepy, but in a cool way. I'm listening to some music on low, nothing special, just background noise. Suddenly, I see something up ahead. At first, I'm squinting, thinking my eyes are playing tricks on me. There's this thing. It's hard to make out, but it's right where the trees stop and the road starts. Tall and kind of human-shaped, but all wrong. It's dark, and at a glance you'd think it's a big guy in a coat. But then I see it's not a coat. It looks more like fur or feathers. Something wild. My first thought is it's an animal, but then it looks at me. I mean, really looks at me. Its eyes catch my headlights and they're shining like bike reflectors. I'm telling myself, drive, just hit the gas. But I don't. I'm there, foot hovering over the pedal, staring at this thing. I'm trying to figure out what I'm looking at. It's too big to be anything I should recognize, and I've seen them all out here. For a second I think, is someone messing with me? Like one of my students? But deep down, I know it's no prank. This thing has an air about it, like it doesn't belong here, like it stepped out of one of those stories I tell. Then, the thing starts moving, but not walking. It kind of shimmies as if it's not totally at ease having to walk. And then, on the other side of the road, it disappears into the woods. I'm not usually the type to chase after things that don't make sense. I mean, I organize books for a living. For me, everything has its place. But this was a puzzle without a box, and I couldn't let it go. I've read enough to know that you're supposed to stay in your car, that going into the woods at night after a creature is chapter 1 of every horror story. But this was my chapter, and I guess curiosity really can override common sense. So I kill the engine and grab my flashlight from the glove box. My heart isn't exactly racing. It's more like it's doing a steady jog. I figure this thing that I've determined a Mothman, if that's what it was, didn't seem aggressive. It just stood there, then slid away, like it wanted to be followed. I head into the woods, trying to be as quiet as I can. The underbrush is thick, catching at my jeans, and I'm not exactly dressed for a trek. The light from my flashlight is bouncing around, making shadows that look like other people are around. I keep going, looking for any sign of the creature. After about 10 minutes, I'm thinking I should have marked my path. I've read about people getting turned around in the woods, and now I'm getting why. Everything looks the same, and the silence is getting to me. That's when I hear it, a sort of low whistling sound. I follow it, pushing through the last line of trees, and I come out into this clearing. The moon's directly above, and it's bright enough that I flick off my flashlight. And there it is on the far side of the clearing. The Mothman, or whatever it is really tall, and even from a distance I can see the eyes. They're not reflecting light anymore. They're just this deep red, like coals in a fire. It's got wings. I can see them now, draped behind it like some kind of tattered cloak. It's not moving, just standing there like it's waiting. For a moment, I'm frozen, not with fear, but with this overwhelming sense of awe. It's like seeing a comet or a solar eclipse, something you only get once if you're lucky. Then it tilts its head, and I swear it feels like it's acknowledging me, like it knew I'd follow. I don't feel threatened, which is the weirdest part. If anything, I feel like I'm supposed to see this, like it's a part of the folklore I've been teaching but never truly believed. I take a step forward, and the Mothman spreads its wings. They're huge, spanning wider than its height. I stop, not wanting to scare it, but that seems like a funny thought now. Can you scare something like this? We stand there, me on one side of the clearing and it on the other. Neither of us moving, just looking across at each other. Then, in a rush of wind that sends leaves flying, it lifts into the air. It doesn't flap its wings like a bird. It's more graceful, like it's part of the wind itself. I watch it go, feeling like I've just been a part of something impossible. I stay there until the sound of its departure fades, and the forest is silent again. I retreat and eventually find my way back to my car. I know this story is one for the books, my own private folklore, but I wonder if I would believe it if someone came into the library and told me the same tale. When I get back to my car, I sit for a while, not starting it up, just sitting and thinking. I didn't get anything to bring back but my word, and in my line of work, words are both everything and not quite enough. But the memory, that's mine to keep, and maybe that's enough to make me believe there's more to the stories I've been telling all these years. I always had a thing for those spots where you can just sit and let the world go by. Being someone who writes and travels, I've got to see a lot of places, temporary stops that feel like home for a bit while I stay there to write. This time around, I landed at the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel in Canada. It's a pretty impressive place, but the real find is this little library they've got hidden away from all the noise. It was one of those cold winter nights when it gets dark early, and there's this quiet that just settles in. The place was stacked with books, and they had this old smell that mixed right in with the scent of burning wood from the fireplace. Kind of perfect for someone who likes to get lost in a good book, which is exactly what I was doing. The lamp with its stained glass shade threw this nice, warm light all over the place. As it got later, the wind outside started howling against the stone of the building, and that quiet inside the library felt even deeper. The shadows danced on the walls thanks to the fire, and it was pretty calming. But then, something changed. There was this draft that came out of nowhere and messed with the pages of my book. I checked, and all the windows and doors were shut tight. Despite the fire going strong, I got cold. The fire did this little stutter, throwing shadows that looked off. And that smell something new and old at the same time, like a forgotten memory. Couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt oddly personal. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was all in my head and that I should just focus on my book. The peace in the library was gone, though, swapped out for this heavy silence. I tried to get back into the book, to forget about the weird vibes in the room, but the more I read, the harder it got. The silence was too loud, and the pages seemed to make more noise than they should. I was getting nervous, and it was getting harder to focus. There was this sense that someone was keeping an eye on me from a corner I couldn't see. It felt like the room was getting colder by the second, a real drop from the cozy heat I was enjoying before. Then, out of nowhere, I saw something from the corner of my eye. A shape, a quick glimpse of something. But when I tried to get a proper look, there was nothing there. Could it be the bride some folks say walks these halls? But that was just the start of the night. Just as I was trying to dive back into my book, something moved. Down the big staircase that leads up to the library, there was this shaky figure coming up, slow and almost not there. The rustling sound was distinct, a sort of whispering that filled the room. There was no mistaking the shape of the figure making her way down the stairs. I gasped audibly as I realized that the ghostly bride was more than just a story. She moved with a kind of elegance that didn't belong in the world of the living. It was hard to take a breath, to even think about moving away. Her presence was overwhelming. The sorrow that seemed to hang around her, it was almost tangible. With each step she took, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. She was wrapped in lace so delicate. It looked like it was made from the fog that rolls over the mountains early in the morning. Even in the dim light, there was a beauty about her that was hard to put into words. Her face held an expression that spoke of loss and longing, and her eyes, they had the depth of someone who'd seen too much. As she reached the end of the staircase, she paused. It was like she was listening for something, maybe a voice from the past, maybe the echo of a laughter that had long since faded. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. It was as if she'd never been there at all, except for the silence she left behind, which seemed to scream in the quiet of the library. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of questions. Had I actually just seen her? The bride that people whispered about, the one whose tragic story was etched into the very walls of this hotel. I couldn't just sit there. I had to know more. So I started looking into her story. The ghostly bride. I started by asking the staff, and the more I learned, the more the chills ran down my spine. Her story was a sad one. Her life cut short on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. They said she fell down the staircase on her wedding day, and now she walked those steps over and over again. The staff spoke in low voices about her, some with a twinge of fear, others with a hint of sadness. Guests sometimes saw her too, always on the staircase, just like I did. That night in the library, I was an actual witness to one of the hotel's oldest and most enduring tales. It was a real-life encounter with a legend, a moment that joined the countless other stories that people would tell about the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel. From then on, I was part of that history too. It's a story that I've carried with me, one that I share when people ask if I've ever seen a ghost. It's a tale of a bride and a ghost, of sadness and beauty, all wrapped up in the quiet corners of a library. I know this isn't a crazy, scary, or super weird story, but I really wanted to share it with you, and I hope you find it interesting enough to share it with all the others who listen to you. Thank you. It was about 3 years ago when I first moved to Chicago. I got this small apartment, a little nook of a place right at the edge of Lincoln Park, which is just north of downtown. I moved here for a job, a tech startup that promised the world, and delivered an office with only a view of the alley. Classic, right? I didn't know a soul in the city, and let me tell you, that first winter was brutal. I'm talking bone-chilling winds that had cut through any coat. Kind of brutal. It was around then that I picked up jogging. I know that sounds weird in the winter, but I was going stir crazy. It wasn't anything serious at first, just a way to keep the blood flowing, you know. But as spring rolled around and the ice thawed, I found myself drawn to those morning runs more and more. It was my slice of routine. My job was a grind. Wake up, code, meetings, maybe a desk lunch if I was lucky, then more coding, then the occasional beer with colleagues who were more stressed than friendly. Rinse and repeat. All right, let me take you back to that morning last spring. I remember stepping out the door, just as the city started stirring awake. Lincoln Park had this vibe in the early hours. Funky and a bit gritty, if you ask me. The paths in the park were clear. The greenery was like a postcard. And the flowers were doing this little morning dance. The Chicago skyline was like a backdrop from a movie set, too, standing there in the distance. It's this mix of concrete and nature that just gets you. That morning was crisp, the kind of chill that wakes you right up, with my heartbeat keeping time like a drum. The park was my kind of quiet. Just the sound of my running shoes hitting the path and the odd car in the far-off distance. I lost myself in the run, letting the park's sounds and smells kind of wash over me. It's like each step was shaking off the weight of yesterday. I had this trail I always took, and that day, the mist was like a blanket over the world, making everything sharper somehow. The flowers smelled like they were right there with you, and the earth. It had that rain-on-dirt smell that's like nature's own brand of new car smell. You could see the dew sparkling on the leaves, like the park was showing off just for me. But that peace, it was like the calm before the storm. I had no idea that things were about to get wild. So, there I was, taking a breather, when I kept on down the path that slices right through the park's heart. The sounds of the city were like background music, barely there. And even though I was heating up from the run, I got this sudden shiver. That's when it hit me. The feeling of eyes on me. Have you ever felt that? It's like your whole body's trying to tell you something. The back of my neck went all prickly, and the world went mute for a sec, like everything paused. And let me tell you, that unease turned into a full-on alert real quick. Something up ahead caught my attention. Something wasn't right. It was like a piece of the picture that didn't fit. That day, as I was huffing it over a small bridge in the park, that's when I saw it. There was this huge shape just perched on the metal guardrails. It stood out against the sky that was just starting to lighten up. A big, dark figure that made me stop dead in my tracks. Now, I like to think of myself as the kind of guy who keeps his head on straight. So my first thought, it had to be a person. Maybe some daredevil trying to get a killer shot of the sunrise or something. But man, my gut was tying itself in knots. There was this cold wave of dread that just washed over me, and it wouldn't let go. As the dawn got clearer, my eyes started to make sense of what they were seeing, and that's when my brain started ringing alarm bells. This thing, whatever it wasn't human. It was all kinds of wrong, a freak show special. It was tall, too tall, and it moved weird, like it was more of a shadow than anything real. And the wings, they were like something out of a nightmare, huge and black and just plain wrong. Like they didn't belong in my city park. Not here, not anywhere. Those wings, they looked like they were stuck onto its back, some twisted joke of nature. And when it looked at me, I nearly lost it. The eyes were red, not like some reflection or trick of the light, but glowing, angry red. I was stuck, man. My heart was drumming so loud I was sure it could hear it. But my feet were like lead. Everything went silent and it was just me and this thing, staring each other down. But then, as fast as it showed up, it was gone. It just spread those massive wings and took to the sky. All that was left was the bridge, looking as normal as ever, and me, trying to figure out if I was losing my mind. The rest of the run is a blur. I remember just needing to get out, to put distance between me and that bridge. I ran like the hounds of hell were on my heels, the only sounds my thudding heart and my feet slapping the path. Ever since then, I've been trying to wrap my head around it. Was it just my imagination running wild? Some joker in a costume trying to get a rise out of early morning joggers? Or, the thought that really gets me, was it something real? Something that isn't supposed to exist in our world? I can't shake the memory or the fear that comes with it. That peaceful feeling I used to have on my runs. It's been replaced by a constant lookout over my shoulder. And when I think about the local stories, the legends of the Mothman, I can't help but see the connections. No matter how out there it sounds, that's my truth. Those red eyes, they're burned into my brain, a permanent part of my Lincoln Park mornings. It's something I can't unsee, something that's changed the way I look at those paths I used to love.